Hi, I'm Anya Fernald. Welcome to the quick pickling episode of Eat Real's Food Craft Basics. Today we're going to talk about a kind of mysterious subject, how to take vegetables and capture their essence and deliciousness for months to come. We're going to do it with a really easy, safe process, and we're going to go with some kind of no-fail vegetables. Of course, you can't go wrong with the ultimate pickle, the cucumber. We'll talk about those. We'll also look at carrots and the surprisingly delicious pickled cauliflower. Of course, we always want to have green onions and garlic as either a base or a condiment in our pickle to add some extra flavor. And one of my personal favorites, pickled beets. So come join me and we'll talk about pickles. So now we're going to make the pickles. And with everything in crafting food, it's not about knowing a recipe, it's about knowing a technique. So the major technique to understand in making a quick pickle is really what are your ingredients and how to get them ready for their passage into immortality in your jar. So we start out with either a raw ingredient or a cooked ingredient. Here I've got some things I'm going to pickle raw. I've got cucumbers and okra that are going to go raw into my pickling brine. A couple of things I've blanched. I've done my blanching for the beets, for my carrots and onions, and then also for the cauliflower. The reason why is just that I want these to be a slightly more tender product so that when I take them out of the jar, they're not quite so crunchy. I could pickle all of these raw as well. They would just be very, very tough. So when you think about how long to cook them and whether to cook them, think about how do you want the product to taste when you pull it out of the jar. Also, when you cook it, think about cooking it to about 80% of where you want to get it. So I've got these beets a little bit soft still, but they're not completely tender. And the reason why is that in the jar with that hot brining liquid, they're going to cook a couple extra minutes. So take them to almost where you want them to go. So next up, let's make some brine. My brine, I always do a mix of vinegar and water. Many people pickle in purely vinegar, totally an option. It's just a little bit acidic for me. I like to make my brines at least 50% vinegar and go a little bit higher depending on the taste that I'm going for and the quality of my ingredients. So my ratio is 1 cup of vinegar to 1 cup of water. I'm going to mix these together. What I do now is for every 2 cups of mixture, so 1 cup of vinegar and 1 cup of water, I add 1 tablespoon of salt and 2 tablespoons of sugar. The reason I've come up with this ratio over the years is mostly that it's really easy for me to remember between the times that I'm pickling, but you can really develop something that you like and something a little bit more complex. Since I've got 4 cups of total liquid here, I'm going to do 2 spoonsful of salt and 4 spoonsful of sugar. Now, at this point is where you can kind of get creative with your pickling. It's more like a recipe. So if I'm doing something kind of sweet like beets, I might want to tone down the sugar. Whereas if I'm doing something where I want there to be a very strong contrast, or maybe I'm starting with kind of a bland substrate like cauliflower, I might want to bump up the salt and the sugar to make it a little bit spicier. I always like to dissolve my sugar and my salt in the vinegar water mix before I cook it. The reason why is that when the vinegar brine is hot, there's so many vinegar fumes that you really can't taste the saltiness. So you got to make sure you got the balance right when it's cold. I'm just going to taste this. Perfect. Next up, I'm going to boil this and add my aromatics. I have a bunch of different aromatics here that are samples of what you can do. You can take your pickle in an Indian or Asian directions with things like star anise. You can go a little bit more medieval with things like cloves and nutmeg. I love to use a mortar and pestle to kind of bang some of the stuff together and make a rough spice mix. Allspice too is awesome for that 13th century pickling kind of experience. If you want to be a little bit more Mediterranean, you can use things like chili peppers or chili flakes, garlic, of course, and then dill is a natural. Next up, let's take our boiling brine and season it in our jars. Okay, so now we're ready to pack our jars. I have 3 types of jars here, a pint jar, a quart jar, and a half gallon. What I'm going to use to decide in terms of which jar is basically how big are my ingredients. Something like my carrots, I'm going to pack into this big half-gallon jar because they're going to look pretty and stand up and they're going to fit, and they're also going to be totally covered by the brine because the jar is so nice and big. For something like a okra or the cucumbers, pack them a little loose there, this is something where I can use a jar like this. Again, they'll fit in simply, nicely. I want to make sure that my product doesn't stick out or emerge in any way from the jar. With this type of pickling where we're going to be storing these products in the refrigerator, they're not going to be at any risk of any major sort of food safety issues because we're using a hot brine and packing them in the cold. I'm not going to be too worried about the type of pack. Whereas if I was doing something like canning an okra or canning asparagus or something, I'd be much more concerned about that. Something like the cucumbers, I can use these little jars. Same thing goes for beets or any of my smaller chunk vegetables. Or if I'd taken these carrots and I'd cut them up smaller, I'd use a smaller jar. The next thing, which is where the creativity and the fun is that I can take my spices and put them in here. For the pickles, these classic cucumbers, I'm always going to want to put in some garlic and then some of the fresh dill. I love the way that gives a great classic flavor to these. And again, I'm just going to put them in there. I can also put them into the bottom, whichever. For the okra, again, you can use things like star anise or allspice are really classics for this type of sort of more of a Middle Eastern style pickle or an Indian flavor. I always like to put garlic in. A bay leaf can look pretty. Soak in a chili pepper. With the carrots, it's very sweet in terms of the base product, so I like to add a bit more spice to kind of complement that. So in my carrots, I'm going to put in some jalapeno, and I'm also going to put in some garlic. Next up, my hot brine. My brine is very hot right now, and I want to make sure that when I'm packing my pickles, it remains hot. The reason why is if the cooler it gets, the less of the interaction I'm going to have with the product because it is going to the refrigerator right away. So I want to make sure my brine is nice and close to boiling, just off the stove. Fill it up right under the lid, about a ½ inch of headroom here. I'm going to put a new lid on it. I always want to use these lids new so that the rubber seal on them is intact, and lock it down. There we go. Boom. This is going in the fridge. It will pop down and seal, but it will not be a shelf-stable pickle. It has to stay in the refrigerator. It'll be ready to eat in about 2 weeks, although it'll be edible in a week. It'll be yummy in 2 weeks, and it'll be awesome after a month. So enjoy.